Welcome into the show this morning. So glad to be with each and every one of you. You're listening to us on News Radio 1440's Facebook Live page. And by the way, if you do want to see this episode later, you always have the option. You can go to youtube.com. We've been really upping our YouTube game. We're posting some individual segments now, so if you want to share just a snippet of the show, you can do that. Really good stuff that we've got coming up for the program. This is still a learning process. We're really only in our third week of broadcast this way, and we've come a long way, and we do really appreciate the support that we've been getting from our listeners, sharing us, trying to get the word out there that the show is now moved to the internet, and so we do greatly appreciate your support. But that being said, we do have a lot of business to get to. If you want to call in, 860-1440, that is the way to get in touch with us if you have a desire to do so, and we certainly hope that you do. 860-1440, that is the way to get in touch with us, or you can tweet us. We've got the Twitter feed pulled up right now, so if you want to comment on anything that we're going to talk about, you want to comment on the Facebook page, we'll take those comments, we'll read those on the air if we have time to get to them. So thank you so much for being with us. We have a lot of news today, and I think this may be one of the biggest news stories, and it's actually not funny, but certainly a little bit disconcerting. It's a little bit sort of ironic that out of all of the stories that are going on right now, I think we're really missing the boat. I think we're not necessarily focusing on the stories that are most important. And maybe that's just, from my perspective. But at the same time, I do think that there are wide sweeping implications for people here in the United States for some of these world stories that are going on. My top two stories I've noticed are barely being talked about by the mainstream media. And I know that that's part of the reason that you come right here every day. You come here because you know that I'm going to cover these stories that mean a lot to you because they mean a lot to me. And the first story, and I think the one that may be the most important, is the situation with Asia Bibi. So just a quick recap. For those of you who haven't been paying attention, if you haven't seen the past couple days worth of episodes, Asia Bibi is a Christian who lives in Pakistan. And she was out working in the fields one day. This was 9 years ago. This was back in 2009. And she's out there working in the fields, and she gets into an argument with these two women who are Muslim. Asia Bibi's a Christian, they're Muslim. And the reason that they get into an argument is because she offered them some water, and they refused to drink out of it because they didn't want to drink out of the same bucket, the same container, I guess, as somebody who was a Christian. That's how deep-seated the hatred of Christians go for a lot of the more radical Muslims that are living there in Pakistan. And so they got into a discussion, and these two women claim, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, I don't know. And again, even if she did do it, I still don't think that that should matter, or that she should be punished in any way for this. But she blasphemed, allegedly, the Prophet Muhammad. Now, she's saying that she didn't. She says that she doesn't, but they were the only two witnesses. There's no other witnesses around her, and these people have a genuine, I guess, reason to dislike the woman because they got into this argument with her. And unfortunately, there's probably been cases of this in the past where people blaspheme Muhammad and they call them on that, whether or not they actually blaspheme or not. Then these people call them out on it because they're Christians or because they don't like them or whatever. And you don't really need a witness. And there have been people that have been sentenced to death because of this. The penalty for blaspheme in Pakistan is death. And this is the conviction that came with her. Her conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. This woman has already spent 8, almost 9 years in prison for an offense that they can't even prove that she actually committed. And again, even if she committed it, if you had religious liberty like you do here in America, it wouldn't matter if you actually committed it or not, because you have freedom of religion. You have the right to express yourself. You have the right to express your opinion and your religious beliefs. And unfortunately, this is not a thing in the rest of the world. And of course, it's not a thing in Pakistan, but the truth is, this is not really a thing in any other part of the world. You don't really have a true freedom of religion. You don't have a right enshrined in the Constitution of other countries the way we do in America. And it really does make me proud to be American and hold the ideas that we do. So the most recent development in this story, which I applaud and I actually called for, I believe, on Wednesday, I was talking to senators and influential people in Washington that they needed to get their rear in gear and not do what Britain did earlier this week, which was deny her asylum because they were afraid of the outcry or the unrest, to use their word, from the Muslim community that might create. So they were fine with letting this woman just hang out to dry, and essentially doing so because they were afraid it was going to cause problems for them rather than do the right thing and actually help this person who's in trouble. And so, luckily, and I'm sure it's because Rand Paul is watching my show. I mean, I'm sure he watches it every single day. But Senator Rand Paul actually did step up to the plate, which I applaud him for. The Kentucky senator, probably my favorite senator in the United States Senate. I love Rand Paul. A real conservative, a real constitutionalist, somebody that cares about the rights and privileges that we have been granted, and he obviously doesn't just care about them for Americans. He cares about these rights universally because they are human rights. And so Rand Paul doing what Rand Paul does, he actually spoke to President Trump the other day about helping her seek asylum, and this is the quote that he gave in an interview. "I have talked to the president about this, and I can't characterize his position, but I know from his concern for the pastor in Turkey and working to get that pastor out that it would be consistent with what they did for the pastor in Turkey to help get Asia Bibi out, and I hope that they will." So this is what presumably is going on. Now, people surrounding Asia Bibi have all had to go into hiding. Her family has had to go into hiding. Her legal team has even had to go into hiding. The main lawyer that took up her case, the primary counsel, as we would call it, I don't know if they have the same phrases over there in Pakistan, but her lead counsel on this had to go into hiding. He's had to flee the country, actually, to the Netherlands to seek asylum. And even lesser known members of her legal team have had to go into hiding because they've been harassed and had their families threatened. So virtually anybody that was even somewhat amicable to Asia Bibi has been threatened. This is how crazy this whole thing has been. And because of how outraged people are at this, the UK basically turned up their nose at her and said, "We don't want the trouble." And I will say, and I want to give credit to our brethren across the Atlantic there were several other European countries that after that happened said, "Well, we'll take her. This woman's obviously in peril. She's obviously in fear for her life and has good reason to be." So a lot of European countries have actually offered her asylum since that happened. Now, the UK's Foreign Office said that they refused her because they feared for the safety of their staff. Here's the bigger question, though. Why are you afraid for the safety of your staff? Why? Let's go back to the genesis of this. Why on earth would you be afraid for the safety of your staff by this woman who is clearly being persecuted for her religious beliefs, for taking her in? Why would you be afraid of the people in your office? And I'm not saying that fear is not legitimate. I'm just saying, why is that fear there? Why is that concern there? It's because the UK has taken in thousands of Muslim refugees. And there are people that are even predicting that if the population growth goes on pace that it is now, not only with refugees, but with reproduction, in other words, Muslims that have been taken into the UK reproducing, that you're going to see, especially in the urban areas, Muslims being the predominant religion in Britain, in the UK. And that does show you the amount of population growth. And if that happens, what you're going to have is essentially another European, because Turkey's technically in Europe. So you're going to have another European Muslim majority country. And this is something that has been a tactic for Muslims for centuries. They'll go into a country and they will, through birth, through reproduction, actually increase the Muslim population in that community and take over it. There's actually, I don't remember the word because I'm a little rusty on my Aramaic. I think that's safe to say. But there's actually a word in Aramaic that the Quran uses to describe this practice. I forget what the word is. It's not jihad. It's like jihad, but it's a similar phrase. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details on that because I'm underqualified to speak on that. But anyway, this is a legitimate conversion tactic for Muslims. And so this is something that has been going on for a while. This is the reason that the Foreign Office in the UK is afraid for the safety of their staff, because there are now so many Muslims in the UK, and there, at least a portion of them, I'm not going to say all of them, I'm not even going to say most of them, but there is a significant enough portion of them that are radicalized, that hate Christians, that would go after these people just for helping a woman that is in fear for her life because she allegedly blasphemed Muhammad. And if something that insignificant is going to set off a significant amount of your population just by helping that person, you've lost the reins. You have lost control. And your society is heading in a very bad place if you can't control that portion of your population. I'm sorry, but that means that the Brits are no longer in control of their own country, because if they are going to capitulate to an angry mob, if they're going to capitulate to terrorists that are trying to keep them from acting in a way that they would deem inappropriate based on their religion, then you're no longer in charge of your country. They are. If they know all they have to do is attack or kill one person or make a scene or, riots in the streets or whatever else it is, if they know that they can do that and make you behave the way they want to, they're in charge, not you. And that's unfortunately the position that the UK has found itself in, to which I would say, guys, get your house in order. Tell them, yes, we are going to help this woman. It is the right thing to do. She does have a right to have her own religion. This is a human right. And anybody that says differently or tries to hurt her will be met with the fullest extent of the law. Because if they get away with this, if they get away with not offering asylum, and they do so on these grounds, even if they just didn't offer asylum because they said we're not taking asylum seekers right now, that might be a little callous, but at least you can see a sort of reasoning there. In this, they're legitimately coming out and saying the reason that we're not doing this is because the mobs tell us what to do. We're afraid of them, therefore we're not going to take her in because we're worried about our own safety. Well, if you're admitting to that and you continue down that road and you don't correct yourself and don't do the right thing, that sends a message to them that all they have to do is pitch a fit and do what they've been doing. And then they can control this office and presumably other offices in the government in the UK. And to give you sort of an example of this and how insane the vitriol has gotten, there's a guy named Salman Taseer. He was the governor of the Punjab, so they're in Punjab. He's in charge over that entire province. And so this is a pretty high rolling kind of guy. Now, I don't know exactly how big that province is, but it's one that's fairly prominent. And so I would guess it would be about the size of a small state probably. And this guy's the governor over it. Well, he actually expressed solidarity with Asia Bibi and said that he supported her and he supported her in this trial. Because of that, one of his own security guards assassinated him. Not some random dude on the street that snuck a gun through. Not some ISIS terrorist or an actual security guard that worked for the guy turned on him and assassinated him just for saying that he supported Asia Bibi. He didn't even actually go and help her. He just said that he supported her. And when this happened, this guy, the security guard, was being hailed as some kind of hero. And that is really just disgusting. And stories like this is what makes me so grateful for the religious liberty that we enjoy here in the United States of America. Because after listening to this, don't tell me America is not the greatest country in the world. We were the forerunners. We invented the idea of a God-given right to freedom of religion, and we put that in our Constitution and said, this is who we are, this is what we stand for. And because of that, even though they don't have an actual amendment in the Constitution in any constitution that I'm aware of in other countries, maybe there's a correction there, but because of that, other countries around us saw that and became freer. They started exercising their religious liberty, and they started saying that, maybe we don't need to have a state religion. Maybe we don't need to persecute people based on their religious beliefs. We were the front runners. So when you're seeing stuff like this, don't tell me America's not the greatest country in the world. Don't tell me that the rights we have here aren't better than the rights in other countries. And if we're comparing countries that were founded on Christian principles versus ones that were founded on Islamic principles, look at the ones that are Islamic countries and look at the ones that are majority Christian countries. There is a stark contrast in the human rights and the acceptability and the tolerance for people of other religions. Because here in America, I'm not saying religious discrimination never happens on the personal level, but by and large, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, if you worship the tree outside your house, doesn't matter. You can still make it. You still are afforded your human rights. As Thomas Jefferson said, it neither breaks my leg nor picks my pocket for a man to say that he has a different God or 20 gods or no God. In other words, he disagrees with him, but it's no skin off my hide if he says that. And I don't have a right to violate his rights because he believes differently than I do. That's the idea of a Christian nation, one that is founded on Christian principles, the principles of Moses and Jesus and the Bible, versus somebody that was based on the teachings of Muhammad. You look at those countries and compare how they treat people to how the countries that were founded on Christian principles treat people. It's night and day, and it is an indication of the parable that Jesus was talking about, where he talked about judging people by their fruits, judging people by their actions and how they treat others. All right, so let's go to the phones on line one. Good morning. What's your name?
Hi, John.
Hey, John from Millbrook. So what do you think about this whole Asia Bibi situation and Rand Paul offering her asylum?
Well, I mean, I think that that's outstanding. That's what should be done. Of course, because what I can't understand is why it is so difficult to offer her asylum and why it's so easy, or there's so many that want to make it easy to come in from the border.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. If there are, and I've said this from the very beginning, if there are people on the border that come into an actual checkpoint and talk to people and make a compelling case for why you need asylum in the United States, perfectly fine with those people coming in. Don't have an issue with it at all. But it is ironic that there are a lot of people, a lot of politicians, and a lot of political pundits that are talking about how poor and downtrodden these people are and basically saying even if they hop over the border fence, they ought to be let in and we ought to do nothing to them. But those same people haven't talked about Asia Bibi at all.
Okay, well, one thing I'd like to address, too, that you brought up just a second ago, with regard to those of Islam, and you know, I've heard the liberals talk about it on the Progress Network.
Sure.
That they are so excited because a couple of people of Islam were elected to Congress. A couple of women, I think, in fact. Why in the world would they celebrate that? Because if they actually utilize the Quran to and follow it, then if they are a big influential segment within Congress, then they would then naturally want to inhibit the rights of others and want to change the culture dramatically from what we have now. And much of it would hit the liberal idea of things much harder than it would the conservative side.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
It actually would, and here's the thing that I'm worried about from that perspective. When it comes to somebody that professes Christianity, atheism, even whether or not I actually agree with the religion, as long as that person asserts that there are human rights and that we have a right to believe what we want to believe and nobody ought to interfere with that, I don't really care what their religion is. But the problem with Muslims, and the problem that I'm made a little bit more skeptical about Muslims, is because their religion actually teaches that you do, through the force of government and through force of law, convert people or you tax them. And so that's the issue that I'm running into. The people that were elected to Congress, I would assume that they don't actually believe that. I don't know. I haven't spoken to them or done research on them specifically. But as long as they're okay with religious liberty on that front, we're good. But the truth is, a Christian that is complying with the Bible will naturally believe in freedom of religion. A Muslim that is complying with the Quran does not believe in freedom of religion, and that's the issue that you're bringing up here.
Right, and I don't see that why anyone actually that's already in our system and is a genuine American, why in the world they would want to have that kind of influence, because they would be the first to take away the rights of women, to, like you said, by force. They would want to change the laws that we have. The alternative lifestyle people, they would be staunch against that, and not only want to, voice their opinion about a disagreement with it, but based on what we see in Middle Eastern countries, if they're the same way, then they would want to punish harshly for being that way. And so I don't get that at all. I just don't.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your call, John from Millbrook. I do appreciate it. That's one thing that I always found kind of comical myself, that you have people on the left, like Rosie O'Donnell is one example that I always use, because she has gone out and stuck up for Muslims. And at one point she even said, not long after 9/11, she said, well, even the people that were engaging in acts of terror, I don't think she was talking about them specifically, but that's what the question was about. And so she was talking about the 9/11 terrorists, and then more broadly Muslims in general. She's like, even the terrorists that they're killing, they're not really bad people. And I'm sitting there thinking, Rosie O'Donnell's a lesbian. She would be one of the first people that were executed. And she talks about how Christians are hateful and vitriolic and spiteful because we say, we disagree with your lifestyle, we think it's a bad idea, and we think that it's actually hurting you whether you realize it or not. And so that is beyond the pale, and that is hateful according to her. But then you've got Muslims that would not tell her that she's wrong at all. They would just soon go out and execute her or drop her headfirst off of a building. And somehow that's preferable to Christians saying, I believe that you're wrong, and because I care about you, I want you to change your lifestyle. I don't understand that mentality. But unfortunately, the left, because generally speaking, radical Islam, not all of Islam, but radical Islam, is the enemy of the right. And because progressives are also the enemy of the right, they've kind of gone together in this holy union, this unholy union, to try to stop conservatives, to try to stop constitutionalism. But I'm telling you, if all the conservatives, myself included, disappeared from the earth tomorrow, the progressives and the Muslims would be at each other's throats. In fact, they would probably be the bitterest enemies out of all the subsections of culture that we have in this country if that were to take place. And so don't kid yourselves if you're a progressive or if you're a Muslim. Believe me, the other side is going to turn on you immediately when they no longer believe that you are useful. And so that is something to really be conscious about if that's where your head is at the time. So speaking of world affairs and human rights, we're going to go on to another story. The UN has actually declared abortion and assisted suicide a, quote, universal human right. This is coming out of one of their committees that they put together, and this is a memorandum. Now, again, the UN has no binding authority. They don't have any actual legal power in the United States of America. It was kind of acted as though they did back in the Obama administration. They took, I don't know why, but they took what the UN said actually seriously. But I would like to point this out. First of all, the UN is wasting their time on stupid crap like this when the Asia Bibi situation is going on. If you're really worried about universal human rights, I would think the universal right to, live would kind of be higher than this one. And also the human right to freedom of religion, which even the UN asserts is a human right, that would take precedent, that you would be working on that instead of working on this. But nonetheless, this is what the UN has come out with this week, which to me is just more evidence that the UN is absolutely completely worthless and we need to be out of the UN. I mean, I believe that for a long time. I believe that long before they did this, but this is just one more piece of evidence that is going onto that pile of reasons I don't think that we have any reason to still have a UN. I mean, so far as I'm concerned, we need to just go ahead and disband the UN, and the UN can still exist without America if they want to, but they're going to have to find another headquarters. They ain't meeting in New York anymore. That's how I would handle it. I see no reason why the United States benefits in any way from supporting the UN as much as we do, and we put forward a lot of that budget. Now, I'm perfectly fine with world leaders having a place to get together and talk. I'm perfectly fine with having summits, but we can have summits in New York City and we can have summits in other cities without necessarily having the UN, because the UN is this sort of quasi-governmental structure that you're not real clear on its authority, but the UN doesn't have any teeth. Whenever the UN condemns something, they just say that they condemn it. It's the US that goes in and cleans up the mess. And so far as I can tell, the UN just wastes a lot of people's time and money, and not just American dollars, but other countries' dollars as well. Well, not dollars, but currency, whatever. But the UN is just completely wasting everyone's time. And the memo stated that nations should, and I'm quoting here, that they should not introduce new barriers and should remove existing barriers, including barriers caused as a result of the exercise of conscientious objection by individual medical providers. So I want you to go through that. We'll go through the first part first. So they're not only saying that abortion should be a universal human right, but they're saying that if any country introduces barriers to them or does not remove the barriers they already have, in other words, if there's already barriers depending on the timetables that we're talking about, for example, in most countries, this is actually not true on the federal level in America, but in most European countries, there actually is a limit on abortion after 25 weeks. There are only 6 nations that allow abortion after 25 weeks other than the United States. And so we're actually in the minority when it comes to that. But this memo is saying that those barriers need to be gotten rid of. We need to get rid of all those barriers. And it goes on to say, including barriers caused by the result of exercises of conscientious objection by individual medical providers. Okay. So, want to be clear on what we're talking about here. What the end of that memo just said, that if there is a barrier that is caused by a conscientious objection by a doctor, then that needs to be removed. So it's a roundabout way of saying it, but what they are saying is, governments, you force your doctors to engage in abortion, regardless of whether or not they believe in it. Because if you're removing that barrier to getting an abortion, and you're saying that barrier was created by the doctor saying that, well, I don't like abortion, so I'm not going to do abortions. What they are in a roundabout way of saying is, you have a doctor, you have a gynecologist, an OBGYN, you make that doctor do abortions regardless of whether he wants to or not. That is unconscionable. Especially when they're talking about universal human rights. Don't you have a right to your own conscience? For example, I'm not Catholic. I have no religious aversion whatsoever to the use of contraceptives. Now, Plan B is different because that's technically not a contraceptive. It kills an embryo that's already been fertilized. I'm talking about actual contraceptives that keep the sperm from penetrating the egg. Anything before the point of conception. I have no religious objection to that whatsoever. But you know what? I'm not going to force that belief on a Catholic that believes that contraceptives are bad. I disagree with him. But just because I disagree with him doesn't mean I want him to violate his conscience to suit me. I mean, to be honest, if I were married right now, because of the point I am in my life and the point I am in my career, if I were married, my wife would probably be on contraceptives. But if her doctor, gynecologist, OBGYN, whatever, said, I'm sorry, I can't recommend a contraceptive to you because it's against my religious belief, I'm fine with that. We either find a new doctor or find some kind of over-the-counter thing. That's fine. That to me is more important than violating the man's freedom of religion, violating his freedom of conscience. The UN is taking the exact opposite approach. They're saying that regardless of why the doctor don't like abortion, whether it's just because he understands that it's a person or he has some kind of religious objection to it, whatever it is, you make him do it. So the UN is putting the right to an abortion ahead of a person's right to free will and conscience. Their priorities are completely backwards when it comes to all of this. Also stated a little bit later in that same memo, young people should have access to contraception as well as guaranteed access to post-abortion health care in all circumstances and on a confidential basis. Now, you have to keep in mind, when we're talking liberalese, and that's the only language that is spoken at the UN, when we're talking liberalese, access means paid for. So in other words, if I don't have access to something, that means that I can't afford it. So if post-abortion health care, and I know I'm using the air fingers quotes a lot here, but I have to. If post-abortion health care, which is what we're talking about, you don't have access to it, what they are saying is it has to be paid for. So now they're not only saying that abortion is a human right and they have to be available, but you also have to have access to contraceptives and access to post-abortion health care. Yeah, you know what would negate the need for post-abortion health care? Not getting an abortion. And so that would solve the problem right out of the gate. And contraceptives, I'm all for people having access to contraceptives. I just don't want to have to pay for it. But typically when you're reading these government documents, which usually are written in liberalese, then what they're actually talking about is somebody else paying for it. So now the UN is telling countries that if you have a doctor with a aversion to abortion, you make him do it, that abortion is a human right, that you can't deny people from that. Oh, and by the way, you also have to pay for their contraceptives, and you have to pay for any health care that they need after an abortion. They have lost their ever-loving minds. So let's go on a little bit further. Last year, the UN actually ordered Ireland to pay a woman $34,000 in American dollars for travel to get an abortion in Britain. So what's going on here is in Ireland, up until just several months ago, 3, maybe 4 months ago, abortion was actually illegal in Ireland. And you can understand that because they have a strong heritage of Catholicism. That's something they're kind of known for. And so because of that, they had a law that abortion was not legal. And during this time, there was a woman that went to Britain, went to the UK so she could get an abortion. The UN ruled that a human rights violation, that Ireland's law was keeping her from an abortion, and ordered Ireland to provide her money for therapy afterward, and ordered her to pay for her travel expenses and her medical expenses to England because they were denying her a universal human right. I got to tell you right now, if the UN came to the United States and I were a president or a member of Congress or whoever, and I'm receiving this letter, I'd have told them to shove it right then and there. No, the UN does not have any authority to tell a sovereign nation how they are going to spend their money. That is not the UN's job. And especially when you're trying to assert that there is a human right here. So let's go back to the, let's go a little bit meta on this. Let's speak a little bit more broadly. Who gave the UN the right to decide what a right is anyway? That's the real question behind all this. See, that's the problem that is underlying this whole issue. The UN believes that it has the authority to grant people rights, that it has the authority to declare this is a human right, this is a human right, this is not a human right, which we've seen in this entire story, saying that you don't have a right to conscience, but you do have a right to contraceptives and abortion and assisted suicide, which is hilarious because they're saying, well, we believe in universal human rights. We believe you have a right to life. Well, you know, unless, of course, you're in the womb, and we don't really believe that you have a right to life if you're considering suicide. Here's the thing about that. And the libertarian in me does feel a little bit of a pull between these two, because I do believe you have the right to do essentially with your body whatever you want to. But if we're talking about it from a moral perspective, for sure, God gave you the right to life. And you don't have a right to take the life of another unless it's in self-defense or something like that, which we clearly see examples of in the Bible. And you also don't have a right to take your own life. That is violence against yourself. And so you are violating a moral principle, and you are violating a human right by denying life to yourself. Denying yourself a right is actually a violation of God's law. And so that being said, you are actually actively taking an action against yourself in assisted suicide. And you're also making the doctor an accomplice to that, which is another moral area that you get into some real tepid waters. Or not tepid waters, turbulent waters. But anyway, this all spurs from the idea that the UN has the right to say what is a right and what is not. Only God has that authority, which was asserted in the Declaration of Independence. Only God can grant you a human right. And the right to life and the right to an abortion cannot exist simultaneously. You either have a right to live or you have a right to an abortion. But if you have a right to an abortion, you are then saying you have no right to life, because it is saying that another person's life is contingent on whether or not you want them to be there, which by definition would mean all murder is now legal. Because if I don't want that guy there, I want him dead, who's to say that that's any different than aborting an unborn child. What's the difference? You are snuffing out a human life for your own convenience. That's no different than any other murder. And so you cannot simultaneously say that we have a right to life and a right to abortion. Those two things cannot be true at the same time. They are contradictory statements. And so this is one of the issues that the UN has run into. And honestly, for this alone, even if I had no other problems with the UN, this alone is an indication that we need to be out of the UN. I would be fine with us getting out of the UN for this incident by itself. Say, look, we assert that there is a right to life in the United States of America, and if you can't get on board with that, we do not need to be a member of your organization. Mic drop, walk away. That's how I would have handled it. And this one, we've been dealing a lot with world affairs. We're actually going to take it a little bit closer to home for this one. Senator Kamala Harris the other day is actually comparing ICE, the members that are in charge of border security, they're in charge of enforcement of our immigration laws. That's the agency that she's talking about. She actually makes a comparison between them and the Klan. Now, I want you to listen very carefully. And this will be a little exercise in debate and a little bit of an exercise in tactics. I want you to listen very carefully to the claims that she's making, and I want you to decide whether or not she's actually making a comparison between ICE and the Klan. We'll go ahead and play that clip now.
So I want to return to the question that Senator Peters asked you about the statement you made describing the Democratic Party as liberal-cratic or neo-Klanist, which was, I think the assumption there was that you were comparing it to the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. So you said in response to his question, you're sorry because the words caused offense. So would you not be sorry if no one was offended by your words?
No, it was wrong to do.
Why was it wrong?
Because those are offensive words.
Why are they offensive?
Because they have history in this country, and I honestly did not mean it that way.
But please talk about the history. What is the history that would then make those words wrong?
Well, the Klan was what we would call today a domestic terrorist group.
Why? Why would we call them domestic terrorist group?
Because they tried to use fear and force to change political environment.
And what was the motivation for the use of fear and force?
It was based on race and ethnicity.
Right. Are you aware of the perception of many about how the power and the discretion at ICE is being used to enforce the laws? And do you see any parallels?
I do not see any parallels between sworn
I'm talking about perception.
Officers and agents.
I'm talking about perception.
I do not see a parallel between what is constitutionally mandated as it relates to enforcing the law.
Are you aware that there's a perception?
I see no.
Are you aware that there's a perception?
That puts ICE in the same category as the KKK. Is that what you're asking me?
No, I'm very specific about what I'm asking you. Are you aware of a perception that the way that the discretion
I see no parallel.
I'm not finished.
I see none.
I'm not finished. I'm not finished. Are you aware that there's a perception that ICE is administering its power in a way that is causing fear and intimidation, particularly among immigrants and specifically among immigrants coming from Mexico and Central America? Are you aware of that perception?
I do not see a parallel between the power and the authority that ICE has to do its job and the agents and officers who do it professionally and excellently with lots of compassion.
Sir, how can you be the head of an agency and be unaware of how your agency is perceived by certain communities?
There is a lot of perceptions in the media and in the public that are incorrect about the agency.
But the perception exists, would you agree? Whether or not it's correct. And wouldn't you agree then that if that perception exists, there might need to be some work done to correct the perception?
All right, so Senator Kamala Harris trying to do her best to grill the guy, even though there's a lot of problems with the arguments that she's making. First of all, this guy, Ronald Vitello, I think is the way to say his name. When he made those comments talking about and equating the Democrat Party to the KKK, I think that it's fair, and you saw the portion of that particular clip where she's asking about that. I think it's fair to say that was over the line. And I've said and called for a very long time, we need to tone down our political rhetoric. Because just because you're right, just because you may be making a good point does not mean you're doing it in a way that is approachable and that will be able to change hearts and minds. And I've tried to model that on the show. I probably fail at that a lot. But the point is, I am working on it and I am trying to do that because I do believe we need to tone down our political rhetoric and quit vilifying our opponents, at least not when it's uncalled for sure. And so those comments were offensive. And he admitted in that, you saw the clip, he made a mistake, shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have said that they were equal, that they were the same. But I will say this though, historically, they were part of the Democrat Party. I mean, there's just, historically speaking, there was a tie there. I'm not saying that the modern Democrat Party is the same as the Klan, but back in the day, the Klan was the enforcement branch of the Democrats. And keep in mind, I come from a state where the Klan was very prominent and they were a part of the Democrat Party. And that really did show itself and sort of was exemplified in the fact that for well over 100 years, the state House of Representatives here in Alabama was held by Democrats. It was a old Democrat stronghold. It's not anymore, but it was back then. And so there are historic ties at the very least to the Klan between them and the Democrat Party. But anyway, if you're looking at this, he does apologize. He seems sincere in that. He explains why, and he says that he regrets making that statement. And then what happens is that Kamala Harris turns around and does exactly what she's getting upset at this guy for, which the criticism of him saying that in the past, I think perfectly legitimate. I think it's perfectly legitimate to call him out on that and to question him on it. But the irony in this whole thing is that 10 seconds after Kamala Harris gets all over his case about it, which I think was justified, she does exactly the same thing that she was accusing him of doing by vilifying ICE and drawing comparisons to them. And she starts saying that, well, the Klan was using fear and force and all of that's true. They do use fear to try to gin people up into making a political change. So they were, by definition, a terrorist group. They were trying to get some kind of political end out of using fear and intimidation to scare people away from polls or scare people to the polls or whatever else you want to do, depending on the tactic they were using at the time. That does, by definition, make them a domestic terrorist group. But what then she turns around and says, well, that's what ICE is doing. First of all, ICE doesn't seem to have a political agenda. It doesn't. It has a job to do like any other law enforcement agency. And just like other law enforcement agencies, like police officers, like, a fire marshal, for example, just like the FBI, law enforcement agencies, the agents do have individual political opinions, and there may be a general overall sentiment within the community of a law enforcement agency. But the idea that they are all working in unison and that they're only enforcing their laws, the laws that are on the books, so that they can get some political end, that's just stupid. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so she's saying that, first of all, she does this game where you'll remember that the initial question that she asks is, do you understand that is, she says, is there a comparison there? And he says, no, there is no comparison. She says, well, I'm talking about perception. Well, no, you just asked what his opinion was. And then he gave you his opinion. And he said, well, no, I'm talking about perception. Because he said, no, there's no comparison. And he's right. There is no comparison. That was dumb. But then she goes in, well, now I'm talking about perception. And so she's hiding behind this veil of perception. It's the same thing that I fuss at journalists about doing, where they say, well, there are people out there saying this, and then they basically give their own opinion and do so trying to hide under the veil of objectivity and saying, well, I'm a journalist. I'm not saying that, but I want you to respond to the things that people out there, these imaginary people I'm talking about, other people are saying. Kamala Harris is essentially playing exactly the same game. She's saying, well, I'm not saying it, but there is a perception out there that this is going on. And so she tries to veil it just a little bit, and then she very quickly sort of betrays herself, trying to hide behind the veil of perception there, because she says, well, if that perception is there, shouldn't you work to correct it? Well, no. If the perception is there, but the perception's not real, then no, we shouldn't correct it. And he says, well, if there's a perception out there. Well, here's the question. How widespread is that perception? Because if we're talking about half the country perceiving that ICE is a terrorist organization that is just arresting people and just enforcing immigration laws, specifically because they want some kind of political end out of it, well, then, yeah, I could see how that would be a problem, even if the perception was false. But you're talking about a group that is incredibly minute. You can find people that believe that the FBI was behind assassinating JFK. That is a perception that they have that is incorrect. But we're talking about what, like maybe 200-300 people in the entire country? Should the FBI really work to correct that? No, the FBI doesn't need to waste their time on that. And here's the thing about Democrats. It has become a new popular thing for the people that are really radically on the left, like Kamala Harris, like Cory Booker, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to say we need to abolish ICE, we need to get rid of ICE, we need to not have it around anymore. One of the New York governor candidates made that one of the centerpieces of her campaign. You've also got people out in Oregon that when ICE officials are being attacked, they don't even send in local law enforcement to help them. And so this is a growing sentiment on the left that ICE is some kind of Nazi-like terrorist organization that is just going around enforcing laws because they really don't like brown people, which is also ridiculous because a lot of ICE agents are actually Hispanic. But nonetheless, that perception may exist, but when you look at public opinion polls, the vast majority of Democrats don't even agree with that. I think the number of people that had a negative view of ICE and their tactics in the last public opinion poll I saw was 86. And so 86% of people say, no, ICE is doing their job the way they ought to. They're not using scare tactics. They're not going beyond the law. And I think even with Democrats, it was somewhere in the high 60s. And so what we're looking at here, the vast majority of Americans don't have a problem with ICE. They don't have a problem with border security and enforcement. The vast majority of Americans think that's a good idea, and they think ICE is actually doing a pretty good job. So the idea that ICE needs to launch this PR campaign to fight the perception of a handful of people, again, that is code for Kamala Harris really saying, well, this is my perception, and that's why she tries to scold the guy on it and very quickly blows her cover. And so I don't understand this mentality that we need to work to correct a perception that does not exist. And she says, another thing that I want to point out, she has a problem with ICE using fear and intimidation against the people that they're going after. And she's saying that that means that they're like the Klan, because that's what the Klan did, is they used fear and intimidation to go after their enemies. Here's the difference. ICE is going after criminals. Just like any other law enforcement official, I want criminals to be afraid of law enforcement. That is a good thing. If some guy is knocking off a convenience store, I want him to be scared of the police. I don't want him to feel safe around the police. I want him to fear for his life when he is around the police officers in that particular situation. Now, the average everyday person not bothering anybody, not breaking any laws, if that person is afraid of the cops, then we have a problem. But if you're talking about somebody that is actively participating in a crime, that person I actually do want afraid of the cops. That person should be scared. And he should be scared that the force and the weight of the law is going to fall down upon him. And the same thing is true about people that illegally cross our border. Look, Democrats, whether you like it or not, crossing the border is illegal. If you want to make it not illegal, you got to pass some legislation on that. Because as of right now, and this is something that is granted Congress to do under the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution, you guys are in charge of enforcing the border and making sure it's not invaded. And if you want to make it okay for just anybody to run across the border anytime they want to, that's fine. You got to put down legislation on it. You can't just, because of your sentiment, say, well, we should just not enforce border law, which basically was the policy of the Obama administration. Now, they were actually pretty good on deportations, but that was the idea of DACA. Basically, the president unilaterally saying, you know what, I don't want to enforce the law in this particular situation, so I'm just going to, with a broad brush, not looking at it on a case-by-case basis, just say, we're not going to enforce the law on these people. Well, you can't do that. You need legislation for it. And she talks about discretion at one point in there. You can't just not do your job and enforce the laws that you are pledged to do. That's part of the job description. And so suggesting that a legal law enforcement agency that has the just authority given to them by the federal government with a task that the federal government is tasked with under the Constitution, by doing their job and enforcing standing immigration laws, is using fear and intimidation to achieve a political end, exactly like the Klan, is so far beyond the realm of reality. I mean, you're past like Narnia and a galaxy far, far away and everything else. You're so detached from reality, you can't even get your bearings straight in this conversation, and that comes across with Senator Kamala Harris. What she's talking about when she says using discretion is really code for, let's just not enforce the law. You should use your discretion to not enforce the law so people that broke our laws will not be afraid of you. Well, if they broke the laws, they need to be afraid of me. And that really does go to the underlying principle, the underlying problem with Democrats as a whole. The truth is, if they were being honest about it, and there are some Democrats that actually are honest about it, what they really want is open borders and for it to not be a crime to cross the border into the United States of America. That's what they really want. And it is apparent based on this that that is also what Senator Kamala Harris also really wants. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to give a very quick election update because I do think that it's important. I think we need to know about it. And then we're going to skip right to the Daily Dose of Stupid. So this particular election, we know that it's been going on for over a week now. They're doing the recounts. They're trying to figure out everything down in Florida. So here's the latest. Ron DeSantis wins the governor's race again in Florida. So he was the governor before. I guess now he's the super governor because he's actually won 2 elections. But no, they did a recount. They did a machine recount. And actually the margin that Ron DeSantis won by actually got bigger. So Ron DeSantis is without a doubt the governor of the state of Florida. You also have the governor race there in Georgia. What's his name? Kemp. Kemp wound up winning the governor's race there in Georgia, so that one is definitively settled now. And the Senate and Ag Commissioner race now goes into manual recount mode because the latest recount resulted in a margin of error that was small enough that they have to now do a manual recount. So now you actually got to go through and they have to have people looking at the ballots and trying to figure out what each person did on the ballot. And I'll say this about the Ag Commissioner thing. In that recount, you had Barbara Snipes down in Broward County who actually reported numbers for people that voted for Ag Commissioner as larger than the Senate seat. There's no way that's true. As somebody who is a student of political science, there's no way that more people voted for Ag Commissioner, even in a state like Florida where Ag is important, than they did. There's no way that happened. I'm sorry. Just a statewide election versus an actual Senate race, there's no way that actually took place. And so that alone is fishy. And I posted it on Twitter. Don't have time to go through all 12 of them. But Daily Signal and the Daily Caller have compiled a list of 12 incidents where Barbara Snipes specifically has either broken election law or violated policy and had to be disciplined for it. So I highly, highly recommend that. And several of them have happened this year in this election. So check that out. This woman has a long-standing history of a lot of funny business going on with elections under her watch. And several times she's been caught red-handed. How this woman has not been fired just for sheer incompetence, even if you happen to agree with her politics, just for not being able to meet deadlines, is way beyond me at this point. There is no way in the private sector this person would still have a job. I mean, this isn't just screwing up a little bit. This is a royal screw up, and it's happened over and over and over again. That person needs to be removed from their position forthwith and very quickly. And like Marco Rubio said, you can't tell me that Bay County in Florida, which just had a Category 4 hurricane which destroyed a large chunk of the town, was able to get all of their reports in before the deadline, And this county, which is one of the richest, wealthiest counties in the country, can't figure it out. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. Marco Rubio's not buying it. I'm not buying it. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
All right, so today's Daily Dose of Stupid, there was this study that was supposedly groundbreaking when it came to global warming, and unfortunately, they made an error. A pretty big one. So essentially what this study was showing initially, and this was the reported findings, is that they did a study on ocean temperature. And actually, ocean temperature is not a bad way to gauge global warming. And the reason that I say that is a lot of these weather stations don't comply with NASA's standard of monitoring weather. So the weather station, for example, will be on top of asphalt, or it'll be in a place where there's shade, or a place where it's near the exhaust from a building or a car. And so all of those things change the actual temperature. And because of that, gauging the air temperature can be a little bit faulty when you're doing it from multiple sources. And even NASA has said that that's difficult to do. Ocean temperature is a much better gauge for it. And that's exactly what this particular study was doing. So they were gauging ocean temperature and trying to figure out how much the Earth is warmed up. And here was what they found. They were panicking that now all of a sudden there were all these new, there was a big spike in ocean temperature. And they were saying, oh my gosh, the globe's actually warming a lot faster than we thought it was going to. It caused so much of a panic that they were predicting the Earth would be unlivable in 12 years. 12 years. Think about that. That means if a baby was born today by his 12th birthday, by the time he was essentially a 5th or 6th grader, then that kid would be in a world that is no longer survivable for human beings. I mean, they were absolutely freaking out about this, about how quickly the temperature was rising. It got picked up by all the major news outlets, CNN, Washington Post. I saw it on there, several others. And they claimed that once that 12-year time limit was up because of the rate at which the ocean temperature was climbing, that the world would no longer be survivable. But here's what happened. A scientist named Nick Lewis noticed that there was a simple math error on the first page. So, just a little math error. Somebody didn't carry a 1 or something like that. And he noticed that it messed with the margin of error. And so what it did was, it took the margin of error from being somewhere around 60 to anywhere between 10 and 70. So that greatly expanded the margin of error. Greatly expanded. And so the guy who's a co-author, and I want to give this guy credit because this is his study and he's being very honest about the mistake made in his study. He said, unfortunately, we made a mistake here. Much larger margin of error in the findings. Our error margins are now too big to really weigh in on the precise amount of warming that's going on in the ocean. We really muffed the error margins. So, Ralph Keeling, I want to give him credit here. He's being an honest broker. He's being what a scientist ought to be, which is saying, oh, results didn't turn out the way we wanted to. Well, guess we can't use it. I mean, at least he's being honest in this. I do give him credit for that. He's saying this is such a wide margin of error that the study's basically meaningless. And that takes a lot. You got to have thick skin to be able to do that, because that means all that work you put in basically means nothing now. But that simple math error really did change the whole scale of how the study was. And now they're saying, okay, well, maybe the temperature is not nearly as bad as we thought it was. Credit for, being honest about it, at least in that sense. And I will say this, Nick Lewis, the guy who found the error, he didn't assume that there was any ill intent. He didn't say, well, this is obviously a conspiracy to make it look worse than it actually is. No, he's saying it's probably just an oversight. And he said, even though he doesn't believe that the study was legit because of this, and the co-authors even said that, well, we really messed that up. Even despite that, he didn't assume any ill intent. He didn't say that these guys were cooking the books or anything like that. He says, look, this is probably just an inadvertent, simple mistake. And so to point out the fallibility of some of these papers, this paper was peer-reviewed, meaning other scientists that are experts in this field looked through this paper and put their stamp of approval on it. And it got picked up by all the major news sources, which I'm not saying that in the future that all peer-reviewed is garbage or anything like that, or we can't trust them or anything. It still is a good way to check for errors. It still is a good way to gauge whether or not what you're reading is actually true. All I'm saying is just look at it with a little bit more skepticism from now on. Because what you want to do is you want to look at it and say, okay, this is peer-reviewed, so this is probably good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no imperfections in this thing. And so, while it's definitely a good way to gauge whether or not the study is good or not, that doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect, because this was peer-reviewed and that mistake made it into the final draft. Even after it was being peer-reviewed, other people didn't catch the error. And the news outlets certainly didn't catch the error. They just reported on it. So I do think that we all need to exercise a little bit of caution, a little bit of skepticism when it comes to reading this stuff. And one thing that Keeling and, one thing that Lewis, the guy who found the error, talked about is he said, I wonder how much coverage this is going to get. In other words, this report, when it came out, because it was all doom and gloom, got all kinds of headlines. All the news sources jumped on it. I wonder how much airtime that these corrections are actually going to get. I mean, maybe they say that there was an error found, but if they do, it's like, at 11 o'clock at night when nobody's watching. And so that is important to note, that there was an error made there and it does need to be corrected. So here was my final question. Is Barbara Snipes crunching the numbers for him? Apparently math is very hard for some people. I will say this, though. I make that joke, but crunching these numbers and actually looking at these figures and stats, I've done that. Not for this particular reason, but I've done, some number crunching. That's a lot tougher than just, counting. I feel like if you're working in an election, you ought to be able to count. It's not exactly the most complicated math equation you do there. 1, 2, 3. I mean, it's not that complicated. I don't see why it's causing all these problems. But anyway, that being said, we'll go ahead and jump to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
All right, Chaplain's Report today, we're going to go ahead and go to the Gospel of John. And this is not long after I say this. I'll have to preface it by saying this. The Gospel of John's not exactly written in chronological order. It's almost written as a commentary or as a topical study on the life of Jesus. So it's certainly taking episodes out of Jesus's life, but it's not necessarily doing them in chronological order. And so this particular saying may not have come exactly after the woman at the well, the chapter right before it, but it certainly fits in with John's theme here and the message that he's trying to communicate. So in the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verses 33 through 36, you have sent to John, talking about John the Baptist, not John the Apostle. You have sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. But the testimony which I receive is not from a man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was in the lamp, and that was burning and was shining, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John. For the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, testify about me that the Father has sent me. So there's a couple things that I want to discuss looking at that particular verse. First of all, you look at the first verse there in 33, where it talks about John being testifying to the truth, but the testimony which I have received. So Jesus is contrasting himself there. He's saying, you're talking about the testimony of John. Now you're talking about testimony from me. These are two different things. John's testimony had a different purpose than the testimony of Jesus Christ. Because as great as John was, he was strong in the Spirit. He was speaking for God. He was a prophet. But he was still a guy. He was still a man. He was not God. And so there is a contrast there between himself and between Jesus. Jesus says, when I speak, it's as if the Father is speaking. And so he's talking about his oneness with God. He's talking about the deity that Jesus himself dwells in, the deity that he possesses. And he's talking about the superiority of his message. Basically, he's saying, John was one of God's mouthpieces. He was a prophet, and his testimony was good. And you were well within your right. You were correct to bask and rejoice in the light of John's testimony. But just so you know, now I'm here. And my testimony is greater than the testimony of John. And so this is what Jesus is alluding to. As great as the testimony of great men can be, they are not to be taken more seriously than the testimony of Jesus Christ himself. There is a superiority that takes place there. Jesus was unlike any other man that was here, because he was the only begotten Son of God. And he says there in verse 35, he was the lamp that was burning and shining, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in its light. But the testimony I have is greater than the testimony of John, because God has given it to me to accomplish the very works that I do. So what's the works that he does? Well, he came to heal the sick, to let the blind see, to feed the hungry. And then, of course, ultimately, we know that the work that he accomplished was his death on the cross. And so that great work that Jesus finally came in culmination, he was saying, as good as John was, he was still a man. And that sets a precedent for us. You don't put people on pedestals that are too high for them. John was a great man. In fact, Jesus said in another passage, among those born of women, there is not one greater than John the Baptist. Man, what a compliment to receive from the person who created the earth. What a compliment to receive. That's wonderful. But John's still just a person. We see this later in Revelation where the Apostle John falls down on his face and worships an angel. And the angel says, no. I'm just a messenger like you. You don't worship me. And so there is this understanding that Jesus and God are completely separate. They're on a completely different plane. And what does that mean? Well, if John's testimony is a lamp, then we must assume that Jesus' testimony is the Son. Jesus is the source. As good as it is to get testimony from a prophet, you're much better off getting it from the horse's mouth. And that really shows the necessity of Jesus coming to earth. There was not a man that was able to accomplish what Jesus accomplished. We were incapable of it. We could not live perfectly. We could not live according to the law and live sinless lives. And we also couldn't speak the way that Jesus spoke. We see another passage where the elders sent Roman soldiers out to arrest Jesus. And when they came back and didn't have Jesus, they said, well, why didn't you arrest him? He says, no man ever spoke like this. Even people that were unlearned, that were not well-versed in Jewish law or anything like that, they saw Jesus and went, whoa, something is different about him. And so because of that, we understand that Jesus is really the source of all things. All that is good, all that is wise, all logic, all reason, it all stems from him, which should do a couple of things. First of all, it should make us grateful and realize that the talents we have, the abilities that we have, they're not a credit to us. We get them from Jesus. We get them from God. We get them from our Creator. And so we ought to use whatever we have at our disposal, be it money, be it fame, be it a great speaking voice, be it a talent for leading songs, be it a talent for helping others and being compassionate, whatever it is. All those things come from God. He's the original source. And so while we may be a lamp, we may have taken that heat and that light from God, we have to remember that he's still the source, and that will make us grateful, and it will also make us humble, because we realize that he is really the one who provides us with everything that we have. And that should also instill in us a sense of duty to use it in a way that he would see fit. Because if we're using it for a purpose that it was not intended for, then we're going to wind up hurting ourselves, and more importantly, hurting God, because he's seeing a gift that he gave us being abused or misused. And so what we should strive to do is to be like John. We realize we're not Jesus. We realize that even though we try to be like him, we're never going to be exactly like Jesus, even though he's the example that was put forward. And so what we need to do is we need to strive every single day to be a source of light to others, to be a lamp to others, that even though we know we're not God, that they get to see a little bit of God through us. They get to see a little bit of his light, a little bit of his love, a little bit of his empathy and compassion and his mercy. And if we do that, then just like John, that will be somebody that Jesus can say, other people basked in your light. You were able to spread the influence of God to other people. And that will be a compliment worthy of being received. A compliment that we can truly be proud of in a life that we can hang our hat on. Stay the course, friends.